Welcome once again to Planet America's Fireside Chat. I'm John Barron.
And I'm Licciardello.
Another supersized show for you tonight with two super guests. Later, we'll be talking to civil rights leader and former Democratic presidential candidate, Reverend Al Sharpton, about Trump's illness, the election, and what African Americans expect from a Biden presidency.
We're going to put your what-ifs about the president's health, succession, the election, the Supreme Court, and all the wild scenarios you can dream up to legal expert Harry Litman.
Plus, a right-wing militia plot to kidnap the governor of Michigan has been foiled, but the governor is blaming Trump for inciting it.
And of course, we're going to take a look at this week's running mate debate, otherwise known as Pink Eye and the Fly. And Trump's pulled out of next week's second debate as well. What a week, John!
What a week! But first, President Trump says he's cured and not at all contagious. Just a week after being diagnosed with COVID-19 and taken to the Walter Reed Military Hospital, he credits the experimental antibody cocktail from Regeneron for his feeling of well-being, rather than the steroid dexamethasone, whose possible side effects include mania and euphoria.
I think this was a blessing from God that I caught it. This was a blessing in disguise. It's a cure. For me, I walked in, I didn't feel good. A short 24 hours later, I was feeling great. I want to get for you what I got, and I'm going to make it free.
That's right. You get antibodies and you get antibodies. Free antibodies for everyone. But the president is less enthused about next week's second presidential debate. The Debates Commission overnight announcing the town hall style event would be conducted remotely, with the candidates in separate locations. Donald Trump, who of course turned last week's first debate into a bit of a chaotic sideshow of interruptions and taunts, doesn't like the sound of that at all.
I'm not going to do a virtual debate.
So Mr. President, you're not going to do it because the CPD, the Commission on Presidential Debates, announcing this morning that the second presidential debate will be virtual. Are you saying you're not going to participate?
No, I'm not going to waste my time on a virtual debate. That's not what debating's all about.
President Trump says he's going to hold a rally instead. Joe Biden was happy with a remote debate format, but also now says he will hold a solo town hall if Trump is a no-show. All of that, of course, at a time when the White House physician Sean Conley is still refusing to provide pretty fundamental information about the president's condition today. He says that Trump's vital signs are good and it will be safe for him to return to public engagements on Saturday. But Dr. Conley still won't say when the president received his last negative test. That is crucial to understanding the timeline and the prognosis from here, and potentially even scandalous, given that Trump avoided having a test before taking to that debate stage in Cleveland last week, when he may well have been at his most highly infectious. And obviously since then, a large number of White House staff, administration officials, senators, top military brass, FBI officials have all since tested positive. And Dr. Conley has still not said if the president has yet to return a new negative test, making the idea of a public rally next week in person from the president or campaigning as early as this weekend potentially, well, dangerous, if not just questionable.
Yeah, I don't know how he can predict when Trump will deliver a new negative test. That will come when it comes. This Conley guy is an interesting character. But for me, there are two major issues when it comes to Trump transparency. One, you've already mentioned, which is when was his last negative test. The reason why that's so important is because you can't contact trace properly unless you know. Not that they're even letting the CDC do contact tracing. They have their own.
White House hasn't bothered. They still haven't called Chris Christie and he's in hospital.
They have their own super duper secret version of contact tracing, which we don't know about. They reckon through their contact tracing that they've traced it back to, I think, the Friday before, the weekend before. That's when they said it all started, but we don't know. No one knows the methodology they have followed.
Well, Trump himself is saying that he probably got it from the Gold Star families that turned up at the White House.
That's the event they're talking about.
Right.
Yeah, that's the event they're talking about.
Yeah, blame the veterans' families again. Good one.
All I know is that 36 people now have caught this coronavirus out of the White House outbreak related to it, and that can keep on growing unless they do proper contact tracing. So that transparency is important. Second kind of transparency that's important is lung condition. They're not showing any details, not revealing any details about his lungs.
Right.
Has he had pneumonia?
Scans, they haven't released the scans.
Yeah. Is there any permanent damage? That is relevant to him running for president. Is he healthy enough to be president in the long term? Because COVID has shown that some people end up with permanent damage. Is he one of those people? We don't know. I will say this, I will defend Trump in one respect, the contagious thing. Now, I don't know how he could know he's contagious or not, but generally speaking, people say, doctors say, not just people, that you're mostly contagious in the first 5 days after you show symptoms. So, which now, there might be exceptions in the case of Trump, but generally speaking, you wouldn't be contagious, well, very contagious at this point in time.
Yeah, but still a little bit contagious. If somebody, like, yes, he was shedding massive amounts of his viral load all over that debate stage in Cleveland. Yes, he was at his most contagious then 48 hours before symptoms allegedly first appeared, but you know the idea that until he gets 3 consecutive negative results that he would be out of quarantine, that's breaching CDC guidelines.
Look, that is true, but I don't want to what about you, but it's something that's been nagging me because we keep on talking about Trump, and yeah, Trump has been behaving poorly, but he's not the only one. Joe Biden was taking tests because he was worried he'd caught it. Remember the CDC guidelines you just referred to say if you're exposed to someone who has coronavirus, you're supposed to quarantine for 14 days. I don't think he quarantined for 1 day. He quarantined until he got his first negative test, and then he was back out again. So now I'm not saying they're equivalent.
Yes, well, but
you should take it seriously.
Of course. Biden's campaign said, well, he wasn't in close contact with Trump because of physical distancing on that stage. But I think you're absolutely right. And the reason why the Biden campaign could not make a big deal about the fact that Mike Pence had also been in close contact with the president and was potentially contagious, and then insisted on the plexiglass in the debate, which we'll get to later, that they clearly couldn't, you know, if Mike Pence was in danger, then clearly Joe Biden was in danger. And so neither of them should be in physical contact with anybody. So I think you're absolutely right, which is why a big deal wasn't made about Pence.
Yeah. I'd like to just quickly move on, though, to Trump's mindset after he emerged from the hospital, because I find this quite interesting. Because there was the potential that he could have gained people's sympathy. Like he could have been a new humble Trump who'd experienced it himself. He was chastened. That wasn't going to happen, but it could have been, right?
You're still waiting for the presidential Donald Trump to emerge.
I'm just saying.
I remember having this conversation in 2015 after the first debate. Well, we thought tonight was going to be the night when Donald Trump showed he could be presidential.
An election a month away can clarify the mind.
Yeah.
But as it turns out, it doesn't seem to have in this case. Like first he tried the line where he almost implied that he got COVID as a result of his excellent leadership skills.
We're going back to work. We're going to be out front. As your leader, I had to do that. I knew there's danger to it, but I had to do it. I stood out front. I led. Nobody that's a leader would not do what I did. And I know there's a risk, there's a danger, but that's okay. And now I'm better, and maybe I'm immune. I don't know.
Yeah, I'm not sure Trump got COVID because he was leading from the front. He wasn't like a first responder or anything. I think he more got COVID because he had lax security standards while trying to be a tough guy. But more disturbing, that was amusing to me. What was disturbing, though, was when he reverted back to talking points from 6 months ago, saying that many people every year, sometimes over 100,000, despite the vaccine, die from the flu. Are we going to close down our country? No, we've learned to live with it, just like we're learning to live with COVID. In most populations, far less lethal. And then Republicans immediately fell in line, like Senator John Kennedy.
2 things stand out in my mind. Number 1, it's very contagious. And number 2, it's not nearly as lethal as the experts told us it was going to be.
Now, that sucks.
He knows better. He's not an idiot. He looked like an idiot, but he's not.
He's a smart guy, you're right. He does know better. He knows, I'm sure, that the standard flu season has only been 100,000 once. And that was back in 1968. And the last 5 seasons combined have seen 178,000 deaths from the flu compared to over 210,000 COVID deaths so far this year. And by the way, those flu deaths are also mostly elderly people and people who have comorbidities, just like COVID. Look, I'm glad that Trump got better so quickly, but to use the fact that you received over 100 grand of top quality and, I might add, experimental healthcare as proof that COVID is easy to beat, that's kind of low in my book. And it's not very fair to the people who can't even afford to get into a hospital.
Unfortunately, it's impossible to know whether he is suffering from the side effects of the medication, which, you know, people have been sort of joking about, but also, well, look at this guy. I mean, this is more than his usual amount of recklessness. You know, if you look back at his Twitter feed since Saturday, you look at his public utterances, it's a little bit more volatile and a little less advised under the circumstances than you would think. Why people around him haven't closed ranks, why his family, his key advisors, often the same people, haven't taken the phone away from him and managed this situation. If the president's well enough to do an interview, or he's well enough to do a video, do it, but make sure it's very, very well calibrated. There is nobody in charge here and nobody saying to the president, that's actually a dumb thing to say, because you're essentially saying those 210,000 dead people are weak.
Yeah, well, with Trump, you take the good with the bad, I guess. He's the PR guy. He runs a PR strategy. On the other hand, though, I'd like to look at the treatment of Regeneron as well. Now, that's his new favourite miracle cure. He stopped mentioning hydrochloroquine, thank God, and plasma therapy. Look, something worked on him, it seems. He thinks it's that. So, look, he certainly turned into the evangelist. It was mocked quite amusingly by the Lincoln Project, I thought.
Hi, perhaps you recognize me. It's your favorite president. I got back a day ago from Walter Reed Medical Center. I went in, I wasn't feeling so hot, and within a very short period of time, they gave me Regeneron. A short 24 hours later, I was feeling great, and that's what I want for everybody. If you're in the hospital and you're feeling really bad, Regeneron. We have hundreds of thousands of doses that are just about ready. You're gonna get better. You're gonna get better really fast. Regeneron. Because I feel great. I feel like perfect. I wanna get for you what I got. Regeneron. And you'll see some amazing things happen. You're gonna get better fast, just like I did.
Okay, so...
he's a good salesman.
Yeah, okay. Now, the thing about this is that he's saying that he's going to give it to everyone for free, right? Which it's a bit of a schlep, because it's only been tried by, I believe, 10 people so far. So to scale up to millions of the doses, it hasn't even gone through its phase 3 trial yet. So I'm not sure if it's even legal to do that. But, okay, let's leave aside the practicalities for a second. I see this as one of the positives, potential positives of Trump, that the negatives are he promises you the moon, he gets bored, then promises you some other astronomical body, and just moves on. But that's a negative. But the positive is that every now and then, one of those wild promises sticks, and he gets something happening that no one else would get happening. And in this case, I don't know if Regeneron works. I think they should finish the trial before they get it out there. But if it does work, I do believe that Trump could go back and go, let's just break every rule and just get it out there to everyone as soon as we possibly can. And that would be a good thing.
Yeah, but it's not happening in 3.5 weeks.
No,
I mean,
he didn't say it has to be before the election.
No, but it's not going to win him the election. Now, maybe he goes into the pharmaceutical business next year. And, you know, that could happen. Look, given the extraordinary turn of events that we have seen this week, there are a lot of questions floating around. A lot of questions usually starting with the words, what if? And often relating to somebody dying and what does the Constitution say about it? So earlier this week, we asked you to send your what if questions in to us, and we got some absolute crackers. I want to preface this by saying, I know that some of these scenarios can seem a little bit insensitive, but we are obviously in such uncharted waters. I think it is still worth asking an expert, and we have got an expert for you. Harry Litman is a former US Attorney and Deputy Assistant Attorney General. He teaches constitutional law at the University of California, and he hosts the Talking Feds Women at the Table podcast. Harry Litman, welcome back to the Fireside Chat.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Our first question came from Claire, who says, President Trump, he's on meds known to cause issues with cognitive function. So why isn't the 25th being invoked? Talking about the 25th Amendment there, about presidential succession. Explain to us what that is and how it could be used.
Sure. Good question from Claire. So the 25th Amendment, as its high number suggests, is a relatively recent amendment. People never really thought about what would happen if a president were incapacitated until after John Kennedy was shot. And then people said, whoa, wait a second. What if he had survived for a week or two? And that's what prompted the passage of the 25th Amendment. And what it says about Claire's question is, if the president is, and this is the important legal term, incapacitated, then certain legal consequences follow. So it's not enough to be sick, ill, under the weather. It is, interestingly, enough to be under anesthesia, even for an hour or two. President Reagan had a procedure involving a fairly short term of anesthesia, but he signed something that actually transferred the powers of government to George W. Bush and made him the acting president. So the short answer under law, the 25th Amendment is triggered when a president is incapacitated and bedridden, pretty sick, generally even on death's door, but cogent. None of those things does it, and you need to be incapacitated.
So basically unconscious rather than just manic or psychotic as a result of steroids, by the sounds of that. So a further question related to this comes from Mickey, Harry, who says, what if President Trump ends up with long-term COVID side effects, such as neurological disorders, problems with his memory? Could he then be removed if he was deemed to be unfit, and who would decide?
Right. So basically same answer. Going back to incapacitation, there is a procedure for the president to say, I am incapacitated, and sign something. And if the president decides, she or he can just do that. There's also a more complicated procedure that's never been used, so-called Section 4 of the 25th Amendment, where other people, the majority of the cabinet and the vice president, can say, this president, I think, is incapacitated. That triggers a complicated process that, importantly, the president herself or himself can countermand. President can say, no, I'm feeling okay, and sign a letter. This is all done legally by just simply signing the letter and turning it over. That's how you become putatively incapacitated, and then you'd have a royal showdown in the Congress. But again, long-term memory problems, COVID side effects, what can you do? Basically, you're left with what you were before the 25th Amendment. It's a issue for impeachment. This guy can't function. He's not discharging his duties. We need to impeach him. 25th Amendment is really more seriously, incapacitated again. Than that.
So, Harry, the Constitution applies to the President. Erin asks, at what point does the health of a presidential candidate become legally problematic? Who and what determines this? Is there a legal framework that sets out who can and cannot continue their campaign for the presidency based on their physical or mental health? So, clearly, the Constitution applies to Donald Trump, but what about Joe Biden?
Yes, well, to both. The legal framework there is set by the individual states. And it's perhaps surprising. Basically, at this point, a couple months ago would have been different, but at this point, Joe Biden is the Democratic candidate. Donald Trump is the Republican candidate. If they were to die tomorrow, they would still be the candidate. There's an instance in which a senator from Missouri was elected after his death. So basically, it would be up to each state and its ballot rules, but most states say as of, I'm just picking a date at random, as of September 1st, that's it. The ballot is now the ballot. So what would happen if Trump said, look, I just don't want to run, or what would happen if he were or someone were to die? Then it would be the ballot would still go on as it was, and it would create a mess. The eggs would be unscrambled after. But at this point, the names on the ballot, both those of the president and Vice President Biden, are set.
Harry Midge wants to know, what if the winning candidate and the VP die between the election and the inauguration? Can the party that won still pick a new candidate? And gives the example of what if Ross Perot had won and then died before inauguration? What's the process there for replacing somebody if they're dead?
Boy, these are some fantastic questions. Okay, after the election, there's a whole period of a few months until the new president takes office. And during that period, there's some very critical dates. And the date that is most critical for her question is January 6th. That's when the electors certify the names of the candidates. If Ross Perot's elected, or Donald Trump and Michael Pence, and they die before the 6th, then there's a provision for the House and or Senate to try to get a new person elected or chosen, pardon me. If it's after the 6th, there's nothing any longer to be done. On January 20th, when the new government comes in, Donald Trump and Michael Pence are recognized as the president and the vice president, and we immediately have a situation in which the president has died, the vice president has died, and we move to a labyrinthine procedure in a statute called the Presidential Succession Act of 1947. And that very scenario is pretty murky. But the big point is, just as now, a couple questions ago, I said even if President Trump were to die tomorrow, his name, he remains the Republican candidate. In the same way, if January 6th has passed, he and Mike Pence, and this would be the same if it were Biden and Kamala Harris, have been certified. They are the ones on the 20th, and you deal with the mess on the 20th. If it's before the 6th, if it's December 10th and it happens, now there's a procedure for the House and Senate to choose someone, just as they would do if no determination had been made in the election.
Here's another one that may be in the improbable category, Harry.
Yeah.
On his shows asks, OK, here's the scenario. Biden wins the election. Harris becomes VP. Biden then passes away. Harris becomes president. Could Harris appoint Barack Obama as her vice president?
You know, it's very interesting. We actually looked at this for the Talking Feds podcast that we had as a separate sort of sidebar question, because your listeners maybe know he could not become president again, just as Trump could not become by virtue of the amendment passed after Franklin D. Roosevelt that says 2 and 2 only. But the answer is yes. He could become vice president. You can't be elected president, but he could become vice president, elected vice president, and if Kamala Harris were then to die, serve as president. But the short answer to the question, yep, she could actually, as could Biden. Biden could have chosen Barack Obama as his vice presidential running mate.
But then Barack Obama as president in a third unelected Obama term presumably would not be able to stand for re-election in 2024?
Correct. The legal limitation is whether you may be elected having already served a certain amount of time.
Thank you, Harry. A real pleasure.
Thank you. Me too.
Now to today's other huge development. The FBI says members of 2 Michigan-based right-wing militia groups had been staking out Governor Whitmer's vacation home and stockpiling weapons, plotting to blow up a nearby bridge and snatch the Democratic governor and overthrow the state government. Whitmer came to national attention in the States after criticising President Trump over the federal government's handling of the pandemic, including concerns the states were being forced to compete with each other for masks and other PPE. She pursued aggressive shutdown and stay-at-home policies to try and reduce the spread of COVID.
Bidding against one another, it's really not a great system. And once you do have a contract, you can find out later that it will evaporate because you'll be told that the federal government needs the material.
Michigan, all she does is she has no idea what's going on, and all she does is say, oh, it's the federal government's fault. And we've taken such great care of Michigan. And
so began a months-long feud that included Trump telling Mike Pence, the head of his coronavirus task force, not to even call Gretchen Whitmer. And when armed protesters stormed the Michigan State House back in April, he tweeted, "Liberate Michigan." Well, it seems that is exactly what these men set out to do. And this morning, Governor Whitmer made it very clear who she thinks is ultimately to blame.
Our head of state has spent the past 7 months denying science, ignoring his own health experts, stoking distrust, fomenting anger, and giving comfort to those who spread fear and hatred and division. Just last week, the President of the United States stood before the American people and refused to condemn white supremacists and hate groups like these 2 Michigan militia groups. Stand back and stand by, he told them. stand back and stand by.
Well, we could tell at the time that those words were going to come back and haunt Donald Trump. And obviously this is happening in a battleground state, so this is a very, very political thing.
It is, and I think it's probably a bit much to blame what Trump said in the first debate on a plot that was hatched in June this year.
Yep, the Liberate Michigan tweet.
That's right, was before then. And I actually think, I'm not someone who likes to blame politicians for when crazy people do crazy things, but I do think that there is a problem in America of escalation going on. And it's not necessarily about condemning white supremacists, which I think only hurts Donald Trump, the fact that he doesn't do it as emphatically as he should without being forced to. I think the problem is general escalatory rhetoric, where just everyone hates everyone else more and more and more. And just the reaction to that, Jason Miller, spokesperson for Donald Trump, said, if we want to talk about hatred, then Governor Whitmer, go look in the mirror. The fact that she wakes up every day with such hatred in her heart towards President Trump. Now, I'm not saying it's going to inspire someone to do something crazy, but what I'm saying is the rhetoric everyone is using is just getting higher and higher. When you start
describing a state governor as a tyrant, and you're echoing the words of, the assassin of Abraham Lincoln. So it's very, very dangerous. The other bizarre thing about this is ordinarily a president of the United States would be fully briefed on the fact that the FBI was onto a plot, and they have been for months now, involving the attempted abduction and possible assassination of a state governor. It is a very, very big issue. He should have been briefed on this. If he wasn't briefed, why was he not briefed on all of this? That's negligence from the briefers around the president. And if he was briefed on this, why was he saying just this morning on Fox Business describing Gretchen Whitmer as the shutdown queen, continuing to inflame the situation? There are lots of questions about this, but I want to get quickly, Chaz, on to yesterday's running mate debate, because it's already receding very much in our memory. It was the clash of the second bananas. Vice President Mike Pence and Senator Kamala Harris. Usually these VP debates really don't amount to a hill of beans unless somebody really stuffs up, like 1988 and Dan Quayle, Jack Kennedy, he didn't look ready for prime time or the presidency. He was battered about by Lloyd Benson. Bush still won that election, of course, though, so that didn't have a big impact. 2008, Sarah Palin wasn't great against Joe Biden, and it probably did matter back then, given that John McCain's age and his history with cancer. His running mate was an issue. So Kamala Harris was possibly in that kind of Palin category, not just as a woman, because she had to pass that threshold test. Was Harris going to look presidential, ready to lead or not? Well, she certainly came armed with a couple of pithy scripted lines.
Well, the American people have witnessed what is the greatest failure of any presidential administration in the history of our country. And frankly, this administration has forfeited their right to re-election.
And she also had a pretty effective warning about President Trump's plans to scrap Obamacare.
If you have a pre-existing condition, heart disease, diabetes, breast cancer, they're coming for you. If you love someone who has a pre-existing condition, they're coming for you. If you are under the age of 26 on your parents' coverage, they're coming for you.
They're coming for you. Pretty effective. But otherwise, Harris seemed to me, at least, to be pulling her punches, maybe just sitting on the fact that she and Joe Biden are leading pretty strongly right at the moment, maybe wanting to be a small target, conscious of avoiding sexist and racist stereotypes about angry black women scaring voters, or maybe she was just wary of going on the attack, because when she did that against Joe Biden in the primary debates, it kind of backfired on her when she was talking about busing. She did gently slap Mike Pence down a few times for speaking over her and the moderator. That didn't stop him ignoring both of them. And again, and Susan Page at USA Today, like Chris Wallace last week, they really struggled to keep the debate to the rules.
Although interestingly, with Mike Pence's talk over, and there was a fair bit of it over the moderator, according to ABC News, Harris actually spoke for longer than Pence did, 38 minutes to 35. I was surprised to hear that.
Yeah, although he was getting 15-second rebuttals and he was turning them into 2-minute answers, and then he was passing on questions where he was being given 2 minutes to answer, or he was pivoting back to, well, now, before I answer, I want to say this. And that's where it got kind of crazy, because he was, time and time again, literally he was answering questions that he was not being given because he was wanting longer to rebut. But for Harris, she had some awkward moments as well when she, like Joe Biden last week, refused to say whether Democrats would be looking at expanding the number of Supreme Court justices from the current 9 to maybe 11 or 12 to overcome the Conservative majority on the court. Take a look.
Now, you've refused to answer the question. Joe Biden has refused to answer the question. So I think the American people would really like to know, if Judge Amy Coney Barrett is confirmed to the Supreme Court of the United States, are you and Joe Biden, if somehow you win this election, going to pack the Supreme Court to get your way?
I'm so glad we went through a little history lesson. Let's do that a little more. In 1864...
Well, I'd like you to answer the question.
No, Mr. Vice President, I'm speaking.
Once again, gave a non-answer. Joe Biden gave a non-answer.
Trying to answer you now.
The American people deserve a straight answer. And if you haven't figured it out yet, the straight answer is they are going to pack the Supreme Court.
Well, we don't know that because even this morning Joe Biden is saying, I'll give you an answer the day after the election. I'm not sure if this is the biggest issue, but it is strange that they won't give an answer. And yet the idea of them packing the Supreme Court, I mean, FDR tried it in the 30s and the public said, do not do this. It's hard to imagine that the American public are going to want yet another norm torn up and thrown out the window next year.
I don't blame Kamala Harris for this. She's following Joe Biden's lead. She has to. But this is political malpractice from Joe Biden. I don't know why he's taking this stand to die on this hill. It's just making it a bigger and bigger issue. It's just ridiculous.
Yeah, why not just a flat bet? Well, we'll see. We'll look at all options.
I don't know.
Yeah.
It was interesting, though, that I noticed Kamala Harris's little tick there during that answer. I don't think we played the particular moment where she likes to go, OK, I'll answer that question. And then she doesn't answer the question. She changes the topic. She did it like 5 or 6 times. It's quite a funny little tick. But yeah, look, for me, I think who cares about who wins or loses vice presidential debates? It's about the key is are these people qualified to be president or not? I thought both of them cleared that bar comfortably. They had too many troubles. And then it's about who builds the narrative that helps the campaign in the wider issues. In this case, it was COVID. The campaign's about COVID right now. Kamala Harris is trying to make everything about COVID sensibly. She's, of course, got the easier argument to make when it comes to COVID, but man, she came ready.
Whatever the vice president is claiming the administration has done, clearly it hasn't worked. The vice president is the head of the task force and knew on January 28th how serious this was. And then, thanks to Bob Woodward, we learned that they knew about it. And then when that was exposed, the vice president said, when asked, well, why didn't y'all tell anybody? He said, because the president wanted people to remain calm. So I want to ask the American people, how calm were you when you were panicked about where you're going to get your next roll of toilet paper? How calm were you when your kids were sent home from school and you didn't know when they could go back? How calm were you when your children couldn't see your parents because you were afraid they could kill them?
Yeah, and poor old Mike Pence had to follow that up, and he was creative. He was creative. He tried to defend the Trump administration by interpreting all of Harris's critiques as an attack on the American people.
But when you say what the American people have done over these last 8 months hasn't worked, that's a great disservice to the sacrifices the American people have made. The reality, if I may finish, Senator, but the American people, I believe, deserve credit for the sacrifices that they have made, putting the health of their family and their neighbors first, our doctors, our nurses, our first responders.
Thank you, Vice President Pence.
And I'm going to speak up on behalf of what the American people have done.
Yeah, good try. He also brought up the swine flu epidemic from 2009. He said 60 million people got swine flu. It feels as deadly as COVID. Whoa! Yeah. Right. I don't think that's going to be very convincing. But, you know, he's drawing a pretty tough hand to defend it.
Still kind of refreshing to see two relatively normal politicians having a relatively normal debate. And Mike Pence, arguably a better advocate for Donald Trump's policies and his record than Donald Trump is himself.
I thought they were both better advocates than their lead. I thought she was better than Biden.
Maybe that's a preview of the 2024 presidential debate right there.
It could be. I won't play the clip because we're running out of time, but I'll just flag for something that we're going to come back to, I think, in future weeks. Pence got a good hit on Harris about tax cuts, where she was talking about how Joe Biden's going to repeal the Trump tax cut on day one. And he said, so you're going to increase taxes on day one? And she said, no, he's not going to increase taxes for anyone under $480,000 a year. And he said, well, the tax cuts go to people under $480,000 a year. So either you're not going to repeal them or you're going to increase taxes.
Yep.
And she didn't know what to deal with it. She didn't know how to deal with that. I think that's going to be a talking point going forward because it was a clever one.
We might look at that next week.
Yeah.
Polls, meanwhile, showed that viewers thought that Harris won the debate with about a 60-40 split, but break that down to gender, and women gave it to Harris by closer to 70-30. Mike Pence's mansplaining and interrupting did not go down well. Harris boosted her favourables as well from 56 before the debate to 63% favourable afterwards. Pence stayed steady on 41 there. Meanwhile, Mike Pence's bloodshot eye created a lot of speculation that maybe he had conjunctivitis, which can be a symptom of COVID-19. The Veep staff said it was just a burst blood vessel. Former Wisconsin Governor Scott Walker and these other Pence supporters are hoping that they're right. Still no social distancing there or masks after this debate. And by the way, Mike Pence has abruptly cancelled his trip to Indiana, slated for tomorrow, sparking yet more rumours. Rumours that will persist until there's transparency on a range of health questions by this White House, including a few negative tests from the Vice President and the President. As for the rest of the polls this week, Joe Biden's lead in the average of national polls is close to double digits now, 9.7%, up from just under 7% 2 weeks ago. That was after Ruth Bader Ginsburg's death put the Supreme Court on the agenda before the first debate and before the White House COVID cluster. Things are heading in the wrong direction for President Trump still. Time is running out. Polls have shown voters did not like his debate performance, and they have little sympathy for his COVID diagnosis either. Joe Biden's lead in the Electoral College this week has blown out as well to 374 to Trump's 164. But according to Larry Sabato's crystal ball modelling, Biden has now passed 270 that he needs to win with just safe, likely and lean Democratic states. He doesn't need anything from the toss-up column. Doesn't need states like Iowa, Ohio, North Carolina, Georgia and Florida as well. He can still win without them. That's why Democrats are getting increasingly confident, although still memories of 2016 loom large, Chaz.
Yeah, they're not going to go over that for a while. What I found most interesting is the apparent effect of Trump's COVID experience on his polling. Survey USA really broke it down. They found that likely voters after Trump and Biden debated, but before Trump had revealed his COVID diagnosis, went to Biden by 8 points. But after Trump acknowledged his illness and before he was hospitalised, Trump closed to within 4 points. And then after Trump was hospitalised, Biden started leading by 16 points amongst likely voters.
No wonder he left hospital.
Yes. Also interesting, every week I seem to point out that Biden's taking a risk with his lack of ground game. Up to now, he's had 0 volunteers out there knocking on doors. Biden's team said they weren't necessary. Well, this week, his team have changed their mind. They've got hundreds of volunteers engaging voters in Nevada, Michigan, New Hampshire and Pennsylvania, and they're expected to spread quickly to several more battleground states. That is a notable development at this extremely late stage, John. Although Biden groups are so far reserving $360 million worth of TV ads in the last month to Team Trump's $170 million. So he has quite an advantage there, does Biden. And finally, some more numbers for you. 1, the unemployment rate is now 7.9%, which is basically the same as it was this time in 2012 when Obama was re-elected, but the recovery is slowing down. In fact, if the rate of jobs created stayed the same as it did in September, it would take another 17 months for the economy to be back to its pre-pandemic levels of employment. Here's another number. In the Financial Times survey of battleground voters, 3 weeks ago, 91% of respondents said that Congress needs to pass another coronavirus stimulus bill to deal with that slowdown in the recovery. In the recent Hill-Harris X poll, 74% said the Senate should focus on passing more COVID relief, compared to 22% who said the Senate should focus on confirming Amy Coney Barrett. And yet, Trump tweeted this a few days ago about the COVID stimulus negotiations. I've instructed my representatives to stop negotiating until after the election, when immediately after I win, we will pass a major stimulus bill that focuses on hard-working Americans and small business. I've asked Mitch McConnell not to delay, but to instead focus full-time on approving my outstanding nominee to the United States Supreme Court, Amy Coney Barrett. So, John, he's not only embraced an extremely unpopular strategy, but he's taken sole responsibility for that unpopular strategy, leaving the Democrats completely off the hook and betraying the the populist fan base that he's cultivated over the last 4 years.
It is an interesting strategic move, Chaz. Our next guest this week has been at the forefront of America's civil rights movement since the 1970s. He's been a presidential candidate, a presidential advisor and pastor. He's an influential voice in progressive politics still through his Politics Nation program on MSNBC, and he's also author of the new book called Rise Up. Reverend Al Sharpton, welcome to the Fireside Chat.
Thank you. Glad to be with you.
Al, there's a lot that we want to talk to you about this week, but let's start. You've known Donald Trump a very long time, being a fellow New Yorker. I wonder, how did you feel just 1 week ago seeing him fall ill and being taken off to hospital as he was?
I was very, very surprised, being that he'd been trying to give the public image that there was doubt in his mind that it was that serious. And then when he was brought to the hospital, I said to everyone, we shouldn't mock him, even though he's mocked the disease, because given his ego and narcissism, I felt he would only go to the hospital if he was really sick. And then everyone kind of stood back and respected the fact that regardless of our political differences, we don't want anyone to have COVID-19. But then he came back true to form. Who else would think in the middle of them being ill, they would decide they need to take a joyride and wave at the crowd and then go home a day later and walk up the stairs and literally rip the face mask off. So even when you try to sympathize with him, he reminds you, no, I'm Donald Trump. Do not act like I'm someone worthy of anybody thinking I have compassion.
Reverend, American society produces outcomes all over the place that are biased against black people. But at the moment, the racial conversation seems to be pretty much entirely focused on police violence. Now, are you happy for the conversation to begin there, or would you have preferred for the focus to begin on some other aspect of inequality?
I think that we would have loved to have got it started in terms of economics, the economic disparity or the educational disparity, but movements don't choose which sparks them. And I think that when you're dealing with physical things on the ground, policing and the interchanging and the interaction on the ground, you cannot choose that. It is one of the many disparities, but it is a disparity. And I think that this was so graphic. When you've got to remember, Chaz, that this video went on American television and then global television at the time of the pandemic. So everyone was shut in. There was no sports, no distractions. People were watching the news every day, all day, hoping to get good news about the pandemic, that it was going down and that they could go to work. And they're watching this over and over. And I think it just caused the reaction that it did. We've had other videos, but this one hit home. And when the family called me and asked me to go to Minneapolis, and I did, and we did a rally, and then I came back and did the funeral, it was enormous. More whites than blacks marching, because I think a lot of people saw this that had never seen this before.
Reverend Al, you write in your book that your party, the Democratic Party, has failed African Americans for generations. That's very similar to claims made by Donald Trump, who says that he's been the greatest president for black Americans since Abraham Lincoln. Does this mean you actually agree with Donald Trump?
No, but you got to read the rest of it. I think that they have failed, but I do not think that they have failed to the degree the Republicans have, and that where Donald Trump has. You understand, Donald Trump has been a businessman in New York for 35 years. I challenged him, tell me one black contractor you used on your buildings. Who are your black vendors? I've gone to meetings there with him. I've never seen a black on the executive floor of the Trump organization. And that's all he ran or mishandled before he was president. So, I mean, it would be a joke if it wasn't so serious for him to say he's done more for blacks than anyone since Abe Lincoln.
Black Entertainment Television founder Robert Johnson is also of the view that black people are too easily won over by the Democratic Party. He thinks the Democratic Party take them for granted, and that if black people form their own political unit that had to be won over, then both parties would pay more attention to black people's needs. What do you think about that?
I mean, I would like to see, he's a billionaire, for him to start putting up the resources to build that party. For him to say, though, that he's open to supporting Trump makes it suspect if he's really serious about building that party. I have a lot of respect for him. I know him well. Let him build that party.
Reverend Al, you also write in your book about how President-elect Donald Trump called you up on the phone on the morning after his shock election victory in 2016. What did he want from you?
He called me up, and I had been on a morning show in New York, and I'd been talking about, you've got to understand that Donald Trump was an out-of-borough guy. He was born and raised in Queens. He was not part of the Manhattan elite. Even though his father had a lot of money, they were not part of the elitist crowd of the real estate tycoons in the city of New York. And he always had a chip on his shoulder about that. So I was explaining that to the interviewer. That's how he could appeal to some of the blue-collar working whites in the Midwest. He comes on the phone, Al, I saw you on TV this morning. You got me right. I'm an outsider like you're an outsider, and we fought our way. Can you believe it? I'm president now, president-elect of the United States. I said, I am having a hard time getting my head wrapped around it. And but I think people don't understand his insecurities, which feeds his narcissism and vice versa, is because he never felt accepted by the barons of industry in New York. And he operates that way, and he never was able to overcome that.
Given your knowledge of Donald Trump, how do you respond to his message saying, hey, I say some insensitive things, but you can work with me to get stuff done, like with criminal justice reform, like with opportunity zone tax breaks, whereas Biden is all talk, he'll never do anything? First
of all, I disagree with Joe Biden in the 90s. I marched against the crime bill. Joe Biden has since said that it had unintended consequences. Donald Trump supports the crime bill methods now. He has said now, not 20 years ago, now we need stop and frisk nationally. So how do you say we want stop and frisk nationally and that we need staunch crime bill, and I'm with the law and order guys, but I'm going to do criminal justice reform? They put up a bill that everyone from Cory Booker and all supported, but we still don't know the numbers of how many people were put out of jail. Under Barack Obama and Joe Biden, 8 years, I was in all those meetings, they got more sentences commuted from the crime bill than the last 11 presidents of the United States. So why don't we tell Donald, I've done more for y'all than anyone since Abe Lincoln, Trump, to put up the numbers from the crime reform bill that he did. In terms of the opportunity zones, a lot of the businessmen are making money going in the opportunity zones and getting monies to set up their businesses or set up their franchises. We've not seen a real uptick in terms of where the people in the community have benefited from that, with jobs or with income.
I'm wondering if I can ask you to put your political pundit's hat on just for a moment, Reverend Al. So many surprises in the last couple of weeks, just 3.5 weeks to go now. How are you feeling as a Democrat about your prospects heading into November 3?
Well, I tell you, I am afraid to be optimistic. That's why I think the Democrats have to fight like they're 5 rounds behind in a boxing match, even though the polls have them way ahead. I will never forget, and I think I wrote about it, I know I wrote about it in the book, that on election night in 2016, my girlfriend and I went to the Javits Center where Hillary was having the victory party, and people were in the back talking about who was going to be on the transition team and who was going to be in the cabinet. And by the time we left and went to a private showing, the map turned around and Trump was winning. It took me a long time to get used to the fact he really won. There was not going to be a recount. So I'm not going to settle for this this feeling that it's going to be victorious for the Democrats until it's announced and he concedes. Well, at least he has to deal with it. I don't know that he will ever concede, but if he leaves the White House, that would be enough.
Reverend Al Sharpton, thank you very much indeed for having a fireside chat.
Thank you. Glad to be with you.
Now, last week, all hell broke loose and we had to cut a bunch of stories from the show, but one of them is relevant again. So let's go way back in the vault and dig it out. Now, do you remember how we recently learnt the Steele dossier was largely based on the information of a guy who they called the primary subsource, who not only said that Steele misquoted him a number of times, but also didn't stand by his own information. He openly admitted they were rumours he'd heard from drinking buddies, amongst others, and he personally expressed doubts about a number of those stories. He told the FBI agents all this before the FBI used some of that information as evidence to obtain surveillance warrants. You remember all that?
I do.
Okay, well, get this. Turns out that same primary subsource was investigated by the FBI as a potential Russian agent and threat to national security between 2009 and 2011. Why was he investigated?
Why was he investigated?
Let me tell you. Firstly, he made contact in 2006 with the Russian embassy and known intelligence officers and expressed an interest to them in becoming a Russian diplomat. Secondly, he told some academics if they got a government job and had access to classified information and wanted to make a little extra money, he knew some people who they could talk to. And finally, he apparently persistently asked academics about a particular military vessel. Nothing sus about any of that, John. In the end, the FBI only dropped the investigation because he went back to Russia until he showed up again as Christopher Steele's major source. Ah, those were the days.
You were so young and beautiful back then.
But then, the Director of National Intelligence, John Ratcliffe, released a letter saying in July 2016, American intelligence agencies discovered that Russian intelligence alleged that Hillary Clinton had approved a campaign plan to stir up a scandal against Trump by tying him to Putin and the Russian hacking of the Democratic National Committee. They didn't know if the Russians were exaggerating or fabricating that, but that's what they'd heard from Russian intelligence. Now, that's convenient for Trump. Well, the bipartisan Senate Intelligence Committee heard those allegations as well when writing their report about the events of 2016. They disregarded it completely. Why? We don't know. Then this week, Ratcliffe declassified his proof. Firstly, the head of the CIA, John Brennan's handwritten 2016 notes, saying, "We're getting additional insight into Russian activities from redacted. Cite alleged approval by Hillary Clinton on 26th of July of a proposal from one of her foreign policy advisors to vilify Donald Trump by stirring up a scandal claiming interference by the Russian security services." That's in Brennan's own handwriting. So at least he was paying attention to this intelligence. Then a few months later, the CIA made an investigation referral to the FBI, citing an exchange redacted discussing US presidential candidate Hillary Clinton's approval of a plan concerning US presidential candidate Donald Trump and Russian hackers hampering US elections as a means of distracting the public from her use of private email server. Now, to be honest, I don't really know what any of that evidence means. There are a million redactions. It's all very confusing and ambiguous to me. But the president thinks it all makes sense.
Slam dunk.
He tweeted an awful lot about this yesterday, saying things like, "Do something about this, the biggest of all political scandals in history. Biden, Obama and crooked Hillary led this treasonous plot. Biden shouldn't be allowed to run. Got caught." And he asked for everything concerning this topic to be completely declassified, which might help. But let me throw a few thoughts at you. Firstly, no one knows whether Russian intelligence was being honest here. Secondly, all because one arm of Russian intelligence was of the view that Hillary was making up Russiagate doesn't mean another arm of Russian intelligence didn't do the hacking. Thirdly, what happened in June 2016 when this intelligence happened, John? I'll tell you. Christopher Steele was hired by Hillary's lawyers to find some dirt on Russian collusion, and Christopher Steele hired that dodgy Russian guy from last week's story. I wonder how Russian intelligence found out about Steele's work. This all kind of makes sense, and it doesn't require a massive conspiracy to explain it. What do you reckon?
I think that we'll probably find out the answers to these things in about 20 years from now, Chaz.
Probably.
But in the meantime, I'm really tired of speculating.
Okay, I'll just say one thing, that the chief conspirator of this whole huge conspiracy was meant to be John Brennan the last time I saw. He was the one that was always the most suspicious about the Steele dossier, though. And in these files, he was actively trying to investigate the whole saga. So but he's the person who was most convinced that Russia is up to no good. So how do the conspiracy theorists explain that? He's the good guy and the bad guy at once?
Well, conspiracy theories are very malleable things. I'm sure they'll find a way to explain that as well. But that is it for another Fireside Chat. We'll be back for a trip to Planet America Wednesday night, 9:30 on ABC TV.
And do not forget the Pet Podcast, where I am going to talk about Julian Assange's extradition trial, because nobody else is.
Goodbye.
See you there.